Most people think the scariest thing about prison is the violence, the gangs, the riots, the murders. But for one inmate, none of those were the real nightmare. After spending 15 years inside a maximum security prison in southern Arizona, he claims the most terrifying thing wasn't another prisoner, it was something pretending to be one. A prison legend about a man wearing another inmate's skin. An old Navajo lifer who believed a real skinwalker was living among the inmates. Strange screams in the middle of the night. Shadows that moved when no one was there, footsteps that raced through the cell block faster than any human could run, and a cellmate who slowly became someone else. This isn't just a story about surviving prison, it's about surviving something that may have never been human to begin with. If you enjoy true horror stories, paranormal encounters, and unsettling tales that blur the line between myth and reality, you're in the right place. Welcome to Haunted Encounters Now. Lock your doors, dim the lights, and let's step inside one of the most terrifying prison stories you'll ever hear. Chapter 1: The Skinwalker Legend. I spent 15 years in prison, and somewhere inside those walls, there was a skinwalker living among us. Before I get into what happened, I should probably give you a little background. I was serving a 15-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary in southern Arizona. What I was in there for isn't important. What matters is what happened during those 15 years. There were countless things that went on inside that prison that no one could explain, and even more things that no one wanted to ask about. It all started with an old prison legend. According to the inmates, something horrific had happened there years before I arrived. Every morning, we'd be woken up before sunrise. We'd stand at the front of our cells while the guards conducted their head count, making sure everyone was present and accounted for. Simple routine, the same thing every single day, or at least it was supposed to be. About a year before I was transferred there, one of the guards noticed something strange during the morning count. One inmate who occupied a cell by himself looked off. At first, the guard couldn't figure out why, so he called another officer over to take a closer look. The closer they got, the more wrong everything seemed. The man standing inside that cell wasn't the inmate assigned to it. It was someone else, someone no one recognized. And according to the stories, he was wearing the other man's skin. Not like clothes, not like a disguise. It hung loosely over him, draped across his body in a way that barely resembled a human being. The inmates who heard about it said he looked less like a man and more like some kind of monster trying to imitate one. But somehow, that wasn't even the worst part. The guards searched their records. The man wasn't an inmate, he wasn't a visitor, he wasn't staff. No one could explain how he had gotten through multiple layers of security or how he had ended up locked inside a prison cell. They didn't know who he was. There were no fingerprints on file, no identification, no paperwork, nothing. It was as if he'd appeared out of nowhere. And then there was one final detail that made the story even more disturbing. The inmate whose skin he was supposedly wearing was never found. Not alive, not dead, no body, no blood, no trace that he had ever existed beyond the prison records. He had simply vanished. Yeah, pretty gruesome story. Now, I know that's not exactly the traditional definition of a skinwalker, at least not the one most people think of. But inside that prison, that's what everyone called him, the skinwalker. It didn't help that, according to the older inmates, the man never spoke a single word while he was there. Not once. Eventually, about a month after the incident, they transferred him to another prison. At least, that's what everyone believed. Most of the inmates were relieved to hear he'd been moved somewhere else, or maybe they just wanted to believe he had. I first heard the story on my second day behind those walls. Hell of a way to settle into what was going to be my home for the next 15 years. Most prisons have ghost stories, ours had something much worse. The strange thing was that man became more than just a scary story. He became the foundation for an entire prison superstition. You couldn't spend much time in the yard without eventually hearing someone mention the skinwalker. Some laughed about it, some mocked it. Others wouldn't even say the name out loud. At first, I thought it was just another prison myth, the kind of story inmates pass around to scare the new guys. I wish that had been all it was, because after a while I started noticing something. The men who had been there the longest, the ones with decades left on their sentences, never laughed. Not once. Whenever the skinwalker came up, their expressions changed. They'd go quiet, avoid eye contact. Sometimes they'd even walk away from the conversation altogether. That was the first time I wondered, what if they weren't joking? What if the story wasn't just a story back then? I still believed there had to be a logical explanation. I wouldn't keep believing that for very long. Chapter 2, Carl's Warning, the story about the man wearing another inmate's skin spread through the prison like wildfire. But over time, something strange happened. The story stopped being about him, instead, it became about what he represented. You see, there was an old Navajo inmate named Carl. Carl had been in prison longer than almost anyone else. No one seemed to know exactly how many years he'd served. Some guys said 20, others swore it had been over 30. Either way, he'd become one of those lifers who seemed like he belonged to the prison more than the outside world. He wasn't loud, he wasn't intimidating. In fact, he rarely spoke unless someone asked him a direct question. But whenever the topic of the skinwalker came up, everyone listened. Carl would slowly shake his head and say, "That wasn't a skinwalker." Then he'd pause for a long moment before adding, "Not the kind you should be worried about." You could hear a pin drop every time he said it. Most of us had only heard stories about skinwalkers from movies or the internet. Carl claimed those stories barely scratched the surface. According to him, a real skinwalker wasn't some monster that lurked in the woods waiting to jump out at people. No, a real skinwalker blended in, it watched, it learned, it adapted. Carl told us that the hardest part wasn't surviving an encounter. The hardest part was realizing you'd already been standing next to one. They don't get everything right. He'd say, they can copy people, but they can't truly become them. Someone eventually asked him how you were supposed to tell the difference. Carl looked around the room before answering. They move wrong. At first that sounded vague, but then he explained. Their speech was just a little too perfect, or just a little too awkward. Sometimes they'd pause in the middle of a sentence, as if they were trying to remember how people were supposed to talk. Their movements weren't natural. They twitched sharp, sudden jerks that no normal person would make their walk. That was another thing. Carl said you could usually spot one by the way it walked, not because it limped or stumbled, but because every step looked practiced, like someone pretending to know how human legs were supposed to move. It wasn't obvious, not at first, but if you watched long enough, eventually something would feel off. One of the younger inmates laughed. So what? We're supposed to think there's one hiding in here with us. Carl didn't laugh back, he simply nodded. I know there is. The room fell silent. Carl leaned forward. I've watched it for years. No one interrupted him. I've seen the changes. I watched men disappear. And I watched someone else take their place. Goosebumps crept up my arms. I remember someone asking, if you know who it is, why don't you tell somebody? Carl looked almost disappointed by the question. You think they'd believe me? No one answered. He was right. Who would believe a convicted lifer claiming a skinwalker was living inside a maximum security prison? Carl continued, I call it the Grandmaster Skinwalker. Some of the guys chuckled at the name. Carl ignored them. It has to be smarter than the others. He explained that most predators hunt because they have to. They strike when an opportunity presents itself. But this one had learned patience. Think about it. Prison is one of the few places where people are delivered to you every week. New inmates arrive. Some leave, some die. Some are transferred, an endless supply of people. Carl believed the creature had realized it never needed to hunt, it simply had to wait. The prison feeds it, he said quietly. It doesn't have to chase anyone. That thought stayed with me, maybe because it sounded so disturbingly logical. Carl believed the creature had spent years studying human behavior, learning, perfecting its disguise. He even claimed it had become so convincing that you might not realize your own cellmate wasn't your cellmate anymore, not for a day, maybe two. By then, according to Carl, it would already be too late. Some inmates laughed the whole thing off. They called Carl crazy, said too many years behind bars had finally broken him. Others weren't so sure. You could tell by the way conversations suddenly stopped whenever Carl walked by, or how nobody liked discussing skinwalkers after dark. As for me, I honestly didn't know what to believe. I wasn't convinced there was some supernatural creature hiding among the inmates, but I also couldn't ignore one thing. Carl believed every single word he said. There wasn't the slightest hint of doubt in his voice. No exaggeration, no dramatic storytelling, just certainty, the kind of certainty that's hard to fake. Still, I tried not to think about it. Prison has a way of making rumors grow larger than life. People need something to explain the things they can't understand. Maybe this was just another one of those stories. Maybe Carl had simply found a way to make sense of years of violence and disappearances. That's what I kept telling myself. Then I started noticing something that was much harder to explain. Every so often, an inmate would change, not all at once. Slowly, almost like watching someone's personality fade away. They'd stop talking, stop laughing, stop making eye contact. Men who had spent years surrounded by friends suddenly wanted nothing to do with anyone. During recreation, they'd sit alone, shoulders slumped, hair hanging over their faces, shuffling instead of walking, barely reacting when someone spoke to them. It wasn't depression. It wasn't fear. It was different. No one ever talked about it, not openly. It was almost as if mentioning it meant inviting the same fate upon yourself. The strangest part within a week or two of changing like that, those inmates were always gone. Officially, they'd been transferred unofficially. No one ever knew where, and nobody ever saw them again. That's when Carl's words started creeping back into my mind. I've watched men disappear, and I've watched someone else take their place. For the first time since arriving at that prison, I found myself wondering, what if Carl wasn't telling us a ghost story? What if he was trying to warn us? Chapter 3, The Prison After Dark. By that point, I still wasn't sure what to believe. Maybe Carl had spent too many years behind bars. Maybe the prison stories had grown into legends over time. Or maybe there really was something living among us. I didn't know. What I did know was this: the prison changed after the lights went out. During the day, it felt like any other maximum security yard. The constant shouting, metal doors slamming shut, guards barking orders, inmates arguing over the smallest things. There was always noise, always movement, always something happening, but at night. Everything was different. The silence never felt peaceful. It felt like the prison was holding its breath. That's when the sounds would begin. Without warning, a loud burst of noise would tear through the cell block. It happened at all hours of the night, sometimes just once, sometimes several times before morning. The sound is difficult to describe. The closest comparison I can make is this: imagine the dying squeal of a pig mixed with fingernails scraping across a chalkboard. It wasn't human, it wasn't mechanical, it was something else entirely. Every time it happened, the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up. You'd expect a prison full of hundreds of men to react, someone yelling, someone asking what that was, maybe a guard checking the cells instead. Nothing. Complete silence. It was as though everyone had made the same unspoken agreement. Don't acknowledge it, don't ask questions, just let it pass. The less attention you gave it, the better. At least that's what everyone seemed to believe. Those screams were unsettling, but they weren't the thing that frightened me most. That honor belonged to the shadows. The lights outside our cells stayed on through the night, casting a faint glow down the corridor. It wasn't bright enough to illuminate everything, just enough to create long, distorted shadows across the walls. Every now and then, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a dark figure slipping across the wall, too fast to identify, too large to ignore. The first few times I convinced myself it had to be a guard walking past, but eventually I started paying attention. There were nights when I knew, absolutely knew, no one had walked near my cell, no footsteps, no flashlight, no keys jingling, nothing. Yet the shadows kept appearing. Quick, silent, gone before I could focus on them. I stopped telling myself they were tricks of the light. One night, near the end of my sentence, something happened that still bothers me to this day. I woke up for no reason, no sound, no nightmare, just awake. I rolled over and looked toward the back wall of my cell. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. There was a shadow, perfectly still, the silhouette of a person. It wasn't distorted. It wasn't vague. It looked exactly like someone standing only a few feet away. My heart nearly stopped. I immediately looked toward my cellmate. He was asleep, didn't move, didn't even stir slowly. I turned toward the bars of the cell. The corridor was empty, no guards, no inmates, no one. I looked back at the wall. The silhouette was gone. I lay awake until morning, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, trying and failing. But if you ask anyone who spent time on that yard, none of those things were the worst part. Not the screams, not the shadows, not even the silhouette. No, the thing every inmate feared were the footsteps. God, everyone hated the footsteps. Even the toughest men in that prison would go quiet whenever someone mentioned them. Unlike the screams, they didn't happen often. But when they did, you never forgot them. It always started the same way: silence, then suddenly slap, 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 wet, wheat feet striking the tile floor. Not walking, running, sprinting. The speed was impossible. Whatever made those sounds could race from one end of the cell block to the other in seconds. Not fast for a person, fast enough that it couldn't have been one. I remember lying awake one night when it happened. The footsteps started somewhere far down the corridor before I even had time to sit up. They were already outside my cell. Instinctively, I whipped my head toward the bars. Nothing. By the time my eyes reached the hallway, the footsteps already sounded 3 or 4 cells farther down. It was as if whatever had passed my cell had moved faster than my eyes could follow. The sound echoed through the block. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. No slowing down, no door opening, no voices, nothing, only silence. The kind of silence that feels heavier than noise ever could. The next morning, no one mentioned it. No one asked if anyone else had heard it. Everyone acted as though the night had been completely ordinary. That was almost scarier than the footsteps themselves, because it meant everyone knew, everyone had heard them, and everyone had decided it was safer not to talk. After months of living with those nights, I stopped wondering whether something strange was happening. Something was, I just didn't know what. Maybe there was a logical explanation buried somewhere beneath the rumors and fear. Maybe there wasn't. Either way, I had learned one thing. When darkness settled over that prison, you kept your eyes forward, you stayed inside your bunk. And if you heard those footsteps, you prayed they didn't stop outside your cell, because no one ever wanted to find out what was making them. Chapter 4. My cellmate snapped. By the time I'd spent more than a decade inside that prison, I'd seen a lot of things: violence, riots, gang disputes, men completely broken by isolation. You get used to more than you'd ever think possible, but there was one thing I never got used to: the way certain inmates changed. It never happened overnight. There was no dramatic outburst, no fight, no warning. They simply started becoming someone else. At first, they'd stop talking. Not just less, not quieter, they'd stop completely. Guys who used to joke during meals or laugh out in the yard would suddenly go days without saying a single word. Then came the posture. Their shoulders would slump forward, their heads would hang low. It looked like they were carrying an invisible weight. They stopped looking people in the eye, stopped joining conversations, stopped acting like they knew anyone. During recreation, they'd wander the yard alone, hair hanging in front of their faces, shuffling their feet instead of walking. If you didn't know them, you'd swear they were completely different people. No one ever said it out loud, but everyone noticed. And everyone knew what usually came next. Within a week or two, they'd be gone. Officially transferred, unofficially, no one ever knew where. No one asked. Carl's words echoed in my mind every single time. I've watched men disappear, and I watched someone else take their place. I tried not to think about it. I really did. Then it happened to someone I actually cared about, my cellmate. We'd shared that tiny concrete box for years. In prison, trust doesn't come easily, but if there was one person I considered a genuine friend, it was him. We looked out for each other, shared meals whenever we could, talk through long nights when sleep wouldn't come. We were family. But after enough years, you become something close. About a week before I was scheduled to be released, he changed. At first, it was subtle. He became unusually quiet. I figured he was having a rough week. That wasn't uncommon, but then he stopped talking altogether. He barely acknowledged me. He spent hours sitting on the edge of his bunk without moving, just staring, sometimes at the wall, sometimes at the floor, sometimes at absolutely nothing. His shoulders stayed hunched, his movements became stiff, mechanical. Every now and then, I'd catch him making these strange little jerking motions, tiny twitches, quick enough that you'd almost think you imagined them, almost. The worst part, he never looked at me the same way again. It wasn't anger, it wasn't hatred, it was recognition without familiarity, like he knew who I was but couldn't remember why. Every time our eyes met, a knot formed in my stomach. I couldn't stop thinking about Carl, about the Grandmaster Skinwalker, about people changing before they disappeared for the first time in 15 years. I was genuinely afraid of the man sleeping less than 6 feet away from me. or whatever was sleeping there. That week became the longest week of my life. I barely slept when I did drift off. It was only for a few minutes at a time before I jerked awake again. Every sound made me flinch. Every movement caught my attention. I never turned my back on him. Not once if I had to lie down. I positioned myself so I could always see him. I told myself I was being paranoid, that prison had finally gotten inside my head, that years of stories and sleepless nights had worn me down. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe then came the night I'll never forget. I woke up suddenly, I don't know why. The cell was almost completely dark for a second. Everything seemed normal. Then I noticed movement. My eyes adjusted just enough to make out my cellmate near the bars of our cell. At first, I thought he was trying to look into the corridor. Then I realized he wasn't standing. He was halfway through the bars. I froze. The bars were far too close together for a grown man to fit through. I'd tried squeezing my arm through them before. I couldn't even get past my shoulder, yet somehow my cellmate had twisted himself between them. His body bent at impossible angles. One shoulder was already outside the cell. His hips somehow followed. Every movement looked wrong, not painful, just wrong. Like his bones didn't work the way bones were supposed to. I couldn't breathe. I just watched, unable to move, unable to speak. Then, slowly, he began pulling himself back inside, not out, in. It was as if he'd already been outside the cell and was returning. Every inch of his body slid between those steel bars with a slow, unnatural motion. No struggle, no effort, just smooth, silent. When he was finally back inside, he stood perfectly still for several long seconds. Then he turned his head toward me. I don't know if he saw that I was awake. I don't know if he knew I had witnessed it. He simply stood there, motionless. Then, without saying a word, he climbed onto his bunk, lay down, and didn't move again for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep, not even for a minute. I sat there until morning, watching him breathe, waiting for the sun to come up, waiting to leave that place forever. By then, I no longer cared whether Carl had been telling the truth, because whether it was a skinwalker, a man losing his mind, or something else entirely. I knew one thing: I wasn't spending another night in that cell if I could help it. And thankfully, I only had one day left. Final chapter, the last thing I saw. Morning finally came after 15 long years. The day I'd been waiting for had finally arrived, release day. You'd think I'd have been excited, happy, relieved. Instead, all I could think about was getting as far away from that prison as possible. I barely looked at my cellmate while gathering the few things I owned. For years, we'd shared the same tiny cell, we'd watched each other's backs, we'd survived that place together. But after everything I'd witnessed over the past week, I couldn't bring myself to say goodbye. Not because I was angry, because I was afraid. Afraid that if I looked into his eyes one more time, I wouldn't recognize who or what was looking back at me. He didn't seem bothered, he didn't ask why I wasn't talking, he didn't wish me luck, he simply sat on his bunk, quiet, still, watching, or maybe just staring. I picked up my belongings, walked to the door, and left without saying a single word. Oddly enough, that made it easier. No awkward goodbye, no final conversation. Just distance. The processing took hours, paperwork, signatures, one last search, one last set of heavy steel doors unlocking. Then, for the first time in 15 years, I stepped outside those gates as a free man. The sunlight felt different, brighter than I remembered. The air didn't smell like concrete and disinfectant anymore, it smelled alive. I stood there for a long moment, just breathing, trying to convince myself it was finally over. 15 years. Prison fights, gang disputes, sleepless nights, the screams, the shadows, the footsteps, Carl's warnings, for all I knew. Skinwalker abductions, I'd survived all of it. Somehow I had made it out. I started walking along the fence that bordered the recreation yard. The same yard I'd stared at for years from the wrong side of the wire. Now I was finally outside it. As I passed the fence, I glanced back one last time. My old cellmate was standing alone in the yard, just like he'd been doing every day during that last week. His shoulders were slumped, his head hung low. He wasn't talking to anyone, he wasn't moving, just standing there. I stopped for a second, shook my head. Honestly, I wasn't even sure it was really him anymore. Maybe prison had finally broken him. Maybe he'd simply snapped like the others. Or maybe Carl had been right all along. I looked away, then something made me glance back across the yard toward the opposite side. That's when I saw him. Carl, he was standing completely alone. Far away from the other inmates, his posture was unmistakable. Shoulders hunched, body slouched forward, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. He wasn't looking at me. He was watching the other prisoners, slowly, carefully, like a predator studying a herd. Then his body jerked a sharp twitch, then another small fast, violent enough that they couldn't be ignored. I froze. Every story, every warning, every conversation we'd ever had came rushing back all at once. I've watched men disappear, and I've watched someone else take their place. For years, I'd assumed Carl was warning us about the Skinwalker standing there outside the fence. I suddenly wondered if he'd been trying to tell us something else. What if he'd been watching it for so long that eventually it started watching him? Carl slowly lifted his head. Even from that distance, it felt like he knew I was there, like he'd been waiting for me to look for one long, uncomfortable moment. Neither of us moved. Then a slow smile spread across his face. Not friendly, not relieved, just wrong. A smile that never reached his eyes. I felt every instinct in my body screaming at me to leave. So I did. I turned around, kept walking, and never looked back. I've been out for about a month now. People ask me what prison was like. They expect stories about gangs, violence, corrupt guards, life behind bars. Sometimes I tell them those stories. They're easier to believe. But I never tell them about the screams or the shadows or the footsteps racing through the cell block in the middle of the night. I never tell them about the man wearing another inmate's skin. I never tell them about my cellmate bending through solid steel bars. And I definitely never tell them about Carl, because if I did, they'd think prison had broken my mind. Maybe they're right. Maybe 15 years in a place like that changes the way you see the world. Maybe there was a logical explanation for everything I witnessed. Maybe there wasn't. I honestly don't know anymore. But every now and then, usually late at night, I'll wake up to complete silence. And for just a second, I'll remember those wet footsteps racing through the prison. That awful squealing sound echoing down the cell block, the shadows slipping across the walls. Then I'll remind myself I'm free, I'm home, and whatever was inside those walls is still there. At least that's what I tell myself. Because sometimes, when I catch my own reflection out of the corner of my eye, I can't help wondering if some prisons were never meant to keep people in. Maybe they were built to keep something else from getting out. If this story kept you on edge, don't let the fear end here. There are many more true inspired horror stories, haunted legends, and terrifying encounters waiting for you on this channel. Every week, a new nightmare unfolds, and trust me, the next one might be even more disturbing than the one you just heard. If you're new to Haunted Encounters, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another chilling tale. And if you've been with us for a while, thank you for being part of this growing community. Your support keeps these stories alive, and we are just getting started. Before you go, tell me in the comments what would you have done if you were in that situation. I read your comments, and some of your experiences are just as terrifying as the stories themselves. Until next time, keep the lights on, lock your doors, and remember some encounters are never truly over.